During this time of quarantine, many people have asked what my thoughts are regarding the interplay between the federal government and the states implementing stay-at-home orders. First of all, quarantine measures are not the first to reach our shores. Our country has had to face yellow fever outbreaks and the Spanish plague of 1918. But this is really the first time since the birth of our country that the federal government is exercising authority in conjunction with the states to reduce the transmission of the communicable disease COVID-19. But largely speaking, the quarantine has been left to the individual states. And so far, the executive branch in the vast majority of states and local officials have not transgressed their constitutional authority. Only a small handful of governors and city councils have extended their powers. New Mexico Governor Michelle Grisham amended her mass gathering ban to fight the spread of the coronavirus to include houses of worship. Many reports came out about the Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear putting out a declaration before Good Friday stating that anyone caught attending a mass gathering in the state over Easter weekend would have their license plates recorded by state police and then would be forced into a 2-week self-quarantine. Even my own governor, Roy Cooper, in North Carolina, has subverted Executive Order 121 and turned it into an executive overreach. These governors are clearly in the wrong. Another abuse of powers is the local police department, arresting several pro-lifers outside several abortion mills, citing they were breaking the social distance order and deeming their services as non-essential. Yet the pro-lifers were not congregating, and it's actually unlawful for law enforcement to force arbitrary orders that infringe upon Americans' First Amendment rights. You see, in those occurrences, law enforcement is picking and choosing who they say has a right to assemble and who doesn't. That is limiting certain liberties because several of these local shelter-in orders are going beyond the least restrictive means to protect the public and violating religious interests. The fact that our very own U.S. Justice Department at one point sought to suspend habeas corpus in order to enact emergency securities during the coronavirus outbreak, that is an outrage. But thankfully, that was quickly squelched. And instead, the DOJ came out in defense of several churchgoers in Mississippi who were fined $500 for attending a drive-up church service on private property. Yes, the government is in the right to exercise their enumerated powers that reside over centralized oversight to the public health and well-being of Americans. But there is no constitutional exception that authorizes Congress unrestricted permission to expand its powers and reach into the privacy of American citizens and strip them of their freedoms on the basis of a pandemic crisis. That would, of course, impinge on our First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments, which deals with the Free Exercise Clause, due process, and equal protection. As my good friend Tim Head, the executive director at Faith and Freedom Coalition, rightly pointed out, quote, "We urge governors to narrowly tailor any limits they place on Americans' movement in their communities and across states as temporary. A federal shelter-in-place order should be prevented at all costs. Public health should absolutely be protected, but so too should the constitutional rights of Americans under the Constitution," end quote. So in a time of quarantine, the federal government's primary role is supplying the states with extra supplies, building up the commerce, reducing certain restrictions on supplies, and lifting regulations to allow progress to be made with testing and treatments. But when it comes to the federal government encroaching on self-governance, that is a big no-no. That being the case, there are actually ample legal precedents and common sense laws that state the health and safety of Americans is a priority function of sovereign states. According to the 10th Amendment, it clearly reserves the right for individual states to impose specific orders within reason to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of their residents. This was reinforced in the Supreme Court in 1824 with the Gibbons versus Ogden case. There's also the Employment Division versus Smith of 1990, which was another Supreme Court case that concluded that if certain closure orders are not specific bans that exclusively target church gatherings, but are neutral laws that apply to the public at large, then they can be lawfully executed. But what does that all mean? Well, it means that the government cannot enforce special restrictions that infringe upon a religious person and their religious activities. For instance, like imposing criminal penalties from police officers standing outside the entrances of a church or at abortion mills. These kinds of enforcements are unlawful because they're singling out a particular religious institution that is exercising free speech and expression of their religion. Now, back to my main point in all of this. If the safety and the well-being is the primary objective, and the scientific and medical data proves an infectious disease can be transmitted drastically by large gatherings, then religious groups should be the first to comply to these less restrictive measures while playing an integral role in assisting their communities and local governments throughout the country to stem the tide of COVID-19. In many ways, religious groups, I believe, have a unique opportunity during this quarantine to showcase themselves and look to lead the way so that others can know how to respond in the midst of this crisis. Now, the great news is most of the religious institutions have complied to the shelter-in orders and taken to the internet to continue providing religious service to their congregants. And what we're seeing on both the federal and state level is minor restrictions that are mainly centered around large gatherings, not the prevention to express and exercise an individual's First Amendment rights. The truth is, the Free Exercise Clause is not a protective blanket that can be used to put people in harm's way. We are compelled to protect life, and during this time of quarantine, we may be giving up some privileges and having to sacrifice a few things. But just because churches are meeting online doesn't mean our civil liberties have been sacrificed. There may be the temporary curtailing or halting of certain religious activities, namely Sunday worship in buildings, but that in no way means the restraining to exercise your faith and my faith. Let me be clear. Elected officials have no rights to deem public worship services as non-essential. This is why if a person or a religious group, church, or institution feel their First Amendment rights have been violated, they can refer to their state's Religious Freedom of Restoration Act to make a claim that the government has substantially burdened their freedom to exercise their religious beliefs. Now that will, vary state to state. But what about churches that are choosing to have drive-up services on their campuses? Well, there are a few challenges with this. But if churches are in compliance with quarantine enforcements in their area, then the states need to be in compliance with these creative worship services. What is blatantly wrong and inconsistent is to deem a local fast food chain as an essential business that can exchange money and yet not consider church services as essential and preclude them from tithing. As my good friend and legal expert Mike Adams points out, that is direct viewpoint discrimination, which is a deliberate violation of the U.S. Constitution because it is their fundamental right to assemble. But again, I strongly urge churches to evaluate their level of risk in their communities and with the highest degree of certainty can promise churchgoers that they have taken precautionary steps that are in compliance with their state quarantine laws. But you know what? We should be proud. We should be proud to witness how amazing so many of our churches and essential workers have been during this quarantine. The vast majority of Americans, without the direction of the government, have remained in quarantine because we know how to govern ourselves and care for those around us better than the government. So I ask that you join me in praying for our government and for our elected officials and for all those who are risking their lives to treat those infected with coronavirus. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep standing strong, my friends.